Once again, I want to welcome you all to one of the public programs of the Carey Institute. I'm Bill Schlesinger, president of the Institute, and we hope to have a series of such programs and lectures throughout the course of the fall and winter and spring months for you, largely on Friday nights. That seems to work well for you and for us, and so we're glad to have you here to join us in that program. As I say every time, our mission at the Carey Institute is to do the best science, unbiased, timely, on important environmental issues, and to translate that for public use to the media, to the corporate world, to policymakers. And so very much the public lecture series is one of the times in which we either present our own science or bring in those that talk about science of others and have synthesized it so well that we feel like there's a good message for the public to hear on important issues. Tonight, it's certainly a pleasure to introduce Paul Greenberg to do just that. Paul is a writer for the New York Times on a regular basis, the New York Times Magazine, the Book Review, the Opinion Page, National Geographic, Gentleman's Quarterly of all things, and Vogue. And I ran into him in Down East Magazine just about a week ago. Lisa and I had this thing about Maine and Maine habitats, and I sat down to read Down East and there with Paul Greenberg talking about fishing there. So many of you have probably seen his articles on the status, the problems with overfishing in the world's oceans, and what we can do about it, although certainly the time is short and the problem is rather grave in front of us. An interesting background, he is a Russian studies major from Brown University in terms of his background, speaks Russian and French fluently, has spent some time in the former Soviet Union advising on various aspects of journalism, scientific journalism, and communication of important subjects to the public. You came to hear him and not me. He's here to talk about his new book, For Fish. The book will be available, and Paul will be available for signing afterwards. But let's get on with the show. Paul Greenberg.
Thanks so much. I'm going to try and keep things relatively informal. I came to this whole business as a fisherman, which is, people are out there who fish. Know fishing is one of the more informal things that you can do. It's therefore one of the more pleasant things you can do. So anyway, I'll talk a bit about the book, talk a little bit about sort of what led me to it. But first of all, I'd like to get a sense of sort of who I'm talking to. And I'm curious, out there, who here considers themselves a sport fisherman? All right, that's good. Any commercial fishermen out here by any chance? Well, we could use more. Anybody here ever see a living sturgeon in the Hudson? All right. And how about shad? All right. Excellent. How many people here carry around a Monterey Bay Aquarium seafood watch card or any kind of card for selecting sustainable seafood? Excellent. So let's see if that covers it. I think it does. I might ask you, there'll be more questions throughout. Anyway, so the book's For Fish, and the question that sort of first comes to people's minds when they see the title is, why For Fish and why these For Fish? The sort of truly honest answer about it is that I have been writing for the New York Times for some time, both on wild fisheries and on aquaculture and fish farming. And my agent came to me and said, let's do a book. And got very excited. I did a book proposal, and lo and behold, we sold the book proposal. And we sold the book proposal originally under the title The Fish on Your Plate, which, before you sell the book, sounds very exciting. But after you sell the book, you think, oh my God, all those fish that could be on my plate. So the short answer is, the reason for fish, anxiety. I didn't want to do 4,000 fish, I didn't want to do 400 fish, but also it was an issue of kind of, what I perceived in looking at how the general public looked at the fisheries issue, there was a certain kind of ADD thing that happened with fish. And in the writing, about fish. That was another question I had. Who here sort of read one of these sort of fish in danger books out there? Right, so like End of the Line, I think Bottom Feeder's another one. But one thing I've noticed, many of them very, very fine books, but they tend to sort of jump around from fish to fish to fish. And a lot of it is because those people writing those books are fish people. As somebody who likes to fish, one of the, I was talking with a fishing guide up in the Adirondacks, and we were sort of swapping stories. And he said to me, well, me and my buddies sometimes go out fishing, and we have competitions during the course of the day. We have biggest fish, most fish, but the one that's the most exciting is most species, most species caught in a day. So for a fish person, that's really exciting. But for the general public who eats fish, the plentitude and the multitude of fish species out there is more than anything else kind of confusing. So what I decided to do was, out of anxiety, but also out of trying to keep things simple, was to choose 4 fish, and you see them out there. Salmon, in the order that they appear in the book, salmon, sea bass, codfish, and tuna. So, I have these 4 fish, and the other thing that I was thinking about as I sort of went into the topic was Michael Pollan, obviously. I assume, who's read Michael Pollan here? Right, so, Michael took a very, I think, again, constructive and easy to understand approach. 4 plants in botany of desire, 4 meals, and omnivore's dilemma. So, I figured it would work for Michael. It worked very well for Michael, so I thought I would try it out here. But the interesting thing is that as I kind of went into it, I started to realize that there was something, a little bit of a magic number about 4 and humans when it came to what we eat. I was reading, when you start to try and kind of gather ideas for putting together a nonfiction book, you have a stack of other books, and you're sort of wondering, where am I going to find my way through this? And I picked up just randomly a book called The History of Domesticated Animals. And in the intro to that book, the writer said, well, in Neolithic times, when humans first came out of their caves, if you look at the middens of Neolithic humans, there might be as many as 24 mammals in the fire pit. There would be lynx, elk, many kinds of deer, wild boar, muskrats, regular rats, everything. Everything was on the table. But by the time of Christ, we're down to pretty much 4 mammals in our fire pits. Cattle, pigs, goats, sheep. That's pretty much it. Of course, there's people who've been to Korea. Oh, what about dog? Of course, hunters out there still bring a deer home from time to time. But when you're talking about the emergence of large-scale industrial animal husbandry, particularly what's happened in the last 100 years, you're really talking about 4 mammals. Again, I started looking into birds, and I was actually having a conversation with Mark Berlansky, author of a great book called Cod. Who here's read Cod? All right, good. It's a really well-informed audience. I appreciate it. I'm a little afraid of the Q&A part, but so anyway, so I was talking with Mark, and Mark actually shows up in the book. I had to do a taste test to see if he could taste a wild cod from a farm cod. I won't tell you the answer. You have to read the book to find the answer. But Mark at the time was working on his oyster book, The Big Oyster, and he was kind of going through all his crazy writer's office stacks of stuff, and he's like, look at all these menus. He had all these menus from 18th and 19th century. And if you look at those 18th, 19th century New York menus, you see all kinds of birds on the menu. Woodcock, snipe, pheasant, all these kinds of things. But again, by the time large-scale industrial animal husbandry comes into play, you got 4. Ducks, chickens, turkeys, geese. Again, occasional pigeon, occasional, grouse, maybe somebody brings in from the field. But basically it comes out 4. So that was a part of the puzzle. And I thought, okay, let's keep going. There might be something here. And then this other sort of statistic jumped out at me, which was that about 50 years ago, pretty much everything we ate from the ocean, with the exception of a few random things here and there, everything was wild. In the next couple of years, wild and farmed fish are going to become pretty much equal in the marketplace. It's a huge epochal shift. We haven't seen this kind of shift really since the end of the Ice Age, when humans started coming out of their cage, hunting populations into extirpation, and then turning to domestication to try and somehow stabilize their animal food supply. So this struck me as this real epochal moment. Suddenly, half of our food is farmed from the sea. At the same time, you are starting to see these sort of large-scale collapses of individual stocks of fish, sometimes entire species, but right now we're mostly talking on a stock level basis. And just for people who aren't acquainted with fisheries terminology, oftentimes people talk about a stock of fish. It's almost like a nation of fish that has its own sort of internal, ecological economics. So a lot of people will say to me, "Are cod extinct?" Well, first of all, cod really are not extirpated anywhere. All the species, all the stocks of cod that existed still exist. They're heavily depleted in many areas, but some stocks are in okay shape. So you can never, with fisheries across the board, except in certain instances, say that a fish is completely gone. It's usually a question of which nation of cod, which nation of tuna has reached a sort of critical level. Grab some water. So anyway, that said, I decided to kind of move through my 4 fish, and the first fish that I started with was salmon, and precisely because salmon was the furthest along in this trading in of wild for farm. A lot of people don't realize this, but this fish up here, the salmon I have here, is the right salmon. I had to fight with the publisher to make sure they had the right salmon on the cover. You wouldn't believe, by the way, what publishers get fish wrong, and this shows the general sort of divorcing of the public from what actual fish are like. I was looking at what's the swordfish lady, Captain? Exactly. I was looking at her latest book about going back to sword fishing. It's like, all about going back to sword fishing. What's on the cover? Marlin. But I mean, it's very telling. It's very telling to see how people are slipping away from a real physical, tactile knowledge of what fish look like, what fish behave like. More and more, they're just pieces of meat on the plate, not wild animals. So, I start with salmon because salmon, Atlantic salmon, are commercially extinct. A lot of people don't realize this. What do I mean when I say commercially extinct? I mean that they still exist. There are wild Atlantic salmon left in the world, but there are not enough of them to make it commercially worthwhile to go fishing for them. So, and this is recent. 50, 40 years ago, all the salmon we ate was wild. But now, anytime you go to a supermarket, you might see Nova Scotia salmon, or Irish salmon, or Scottish salmon, or Icelandic salmon. It is all farmed. And we even had, we had wild salmon in our backyard. There was a significant run of wild salmon in the Connecticut River, all up and down from the Connecticut River northward. Many rivers had very, very significant runs of wild Atlantic salmon. And they are basically no more, except for Maine at this point, and even those, I believe, have endangered species status at this point. How did this happen? Well, we lost a lot of salmon, obviously, through habitat degradation. You dam a river, you're going to lose the salmon. But, what people don't always realize, and something I found out in the course of my research, is that damming and habitat destruction is not the whole story. There's a very interesting thing that happened with Atlantic salmon is that in the 50s, a small group of Danish and Faroese fishermen found a little patch off Greenland where every single Atlantic salmon in the world goes to feed. Very, very small area. And, Atlantic salmon exists on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. So this great convergence of Atlantic salmon was identified. And when this very small group of fishermen found these fish, what do? They fished them, and they fished them extremely hard. And so from that point forward, if you draw a graph from colonial times forward, there is a gradual decline of Atlantic salmon from the colonial, even before the colonial period, even with Native American fishermen, you do see a decline. But when those Faroese fishermen find that aggregation off of Greenland, that's when it really hits. But what's interesting is that almost right around the same time, a little bit later, as wild salmon go into extreme, extreme decline, farmed salmon goes in the completely opposite direction. How did that happen? Well, it's interesting. During the course of my research, I met a guy named Bluefin Tuna, who is a Norwegian sheep breeder. And he was a guy who is probably in his 80s at this point. Childhood depression, somebody very much concerned about availability of food, food security, all those kinds of things. And in the, I think the early 1960s, he was invited on a Fulbright over to the United States, where he met with a guy named J. Lawrence Lush, who is considered to be one of the founders of animal breeding, modern animal breeding, using quantitative genetics. And Lush basically impressed on Bluefin Tuna that if you start a selective breeding program for salmon, you can get the kind of growth rates that we have achieved with land animals. Now, it's taken us 2,000 years to get to the point where we've probably doubled the feed efficiency, doubled the growth rate of the land food that we eat. But what's kind of amazing, what happened with the Norwegian salmon experiment, is that in just about 15, 20 years, a fraction of what it took on land, they managed to double the growth rate with Atlantic salmon. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that salmon have a relatively short reproductive interval, so that you can go through generations relatively quickly. But the other more important thing is that they just produce many, many more offspring. So you have many, many opportunities to cross and recross and figure out what are the genetic characteristics that you're looking for. And so what happened was this incredibly advanced, for its time anyway, selective breeding program where they selected salmon from 40 river systems in Norway, and these rivers all had very different characteristics. But by crossing them and intercrossing them and recrossing them, they ended up with a salmon that grew twice as fast. And for those of you who have been following the news, how many people have heard about the transgenic salmon that's in FDA right now? Yeah, so that is a situation where, in a way, it's taken salmon to the next extreme. So we've already got the selectively bred pool of salmon that already grows twice as fast as the wild Atlantic salmon. What's now on the table is a company called AquaBounty out of Waltham, Massachusetts, has come up with a salmon where they take an Atlantic salmon, an already selectively bred Atlantic salmon, put a Chinook salmon growth gene into the Atlantic salmon, and then attach onto that a regulator protein from a third fish called an ocean pout, which doesn't even share the same taxonomic order as salmon, and basically flip that switch permanently on. And what you end up with is a salmon that grows twice as fast as the already twice as fast growing Atlantic salmon. Now, it's particularly relevant at this very moment that they're talking about, once again, trying to double the growth rate of Atlantic salmon, because all along the way, as we've been increasing the productivity of salmon, as we've been getting more salmon on our plate, the range of wild salmon, not just in the Atlantic, but now in the Pacific, is collapsing. California, Oregon, moving on into Washington, we're all seeing huge, huge collapses of those fisheries across the board. And a lot of people out there, well, there's always Alaska. We've always got Alaska, right? There's, and indeed, many, many, many millions of pounds of salmon coming out of Alaska every year. But it's very interesting to note, and I'm going to say, I said this in a commentary I'm doing for Living on Earth. You can listen on the radio this weekend. So if we use the AquaBounty transgenic salmon to double the growth rate of Atlantic salmon, we're going to have about 250 million more pounds of salmon available for us to eat in the next few years. What's interesting is at the same time as this happening, a consortium called Anglo-American is on the verge of being approved to construct the country's biggest open-pit gold and copper mine at the headwaters of Bristol Bay in Alaska. This is the most productive salmon fishery left on Earth. 40 million fish migrate into Bristol Bay every year. Copper mines are deadly to fish that require clean water like salmon. There was a copper mine failure in China just 2 months ago, killed millions of fish. So what's interesting, if you do the math and you run the numbers and you multiply the number of fish in Bristol Bay times the average weight of a sockeye salmon, what do you get? 250 million pounds of salmon. So on the one hand, Aqua Bounty, 250 million pounds more of transgenic salmon. Anglo-American mining, 250 million pounds less of wild salmon. There's no conspiracy here. You know, Aqua Bounty isn't talking to Anglo-American to try and work this situation out. But what it is, it shows to me an underlying sinisterness to humanity, at least vis-a-vis the natural world, in that we seem to have this desire to tame nature, and once we've gotten our food source secure through artificial means, then we can go about the eradication of a wild food system. So that was sort of the, that's the through line in the salmon chapter, although the pebble mine thing is really more recent and it's not actually in the book, but it's something I've really been talking a lot about. If people are interested in getting involved in a way in stopping the Anglo-American venture, if you go to savebristolbay.org, there's a very serious campaign being mounted right now by Travel Limited, and it's a very, very important campaign, probably the most important thing facing fish. A lot of people will talk afterwards. I'm sure people are going to have questions, which fish should I eat? In my mind, eat whatever salmon you want, but just sign the petition for Bristol Bay. It's the best thing you can do for salmon at this point. So anyway, so that's salmon. Next fish on the list was another fish that came into domestication, again on the heels of the Green Revolution. Everyone's familiar with the term the Green Revolution, right? The Green Revolution, incredibly boosting the productivity of grains, livestock on land, but the Green Revolution sort of fed into what is now called the Blue Revolution. The last 50 years has seen an incredible biotech revolution when it comes to figuring out fish. And fish, there are a lot of them, and they're very different. In the order Perciformes, the order from which most of the fish that we eat comes from, your tunas, your basses, your snappers, all from the order Perciformes. There are 7,000 species in that order alone. It's the most populous in terms of species of any order on Earth. So there's a lot of fish out there. And a lot of people out there want to crack the codes on those fish. So this next fish is the branzino, or the European sea bass. Anybody who here has ever eaten a branzino? Or a loup de mer? Seen that in the restaurant? So it's the same fish. Branzino, loup de mer, European sea bass, robalo in Spanish. But what's interesting is while everyone gets their setting themselves all in a twist over, is that salmon wild, is that salmon wild, what's wild salmon? They never seem to ask that question when it comes to the branzino. It's like, oh, the branzino is from Italy. Oh, it's beautiful. Or it's a sea bass. Sea bass, it must be from the sea. Well, in fact, even more than salmon today, the European sea bass is the most farmed animal that you're likely to see. And you'll often see it paired on a menu with another fish that's sometimes called dorade or orata or sometimes sea green. These are two fish that are from the Mediterranean that, when they reach our plates nowadays, are 100% domesticated. And even when you go to Europe now, on the European market, you go to the Central Fish Market in Athens, which is where a lot of these fish come from at this point, there'll be huge cases and cases of these exactly plate-sized farmed fish. And then off to the corner, you'll see a random selection of wild sea bass. And they're usually about 2 or 3 times bigger. They're greener. They're kind of more interesting looking. But what's interesting, after talking to a lot of aquaculture scientists who were involved with the project, I was to learn that actually even the wild sea bass are actually just escapees at this point in the Mediterranean. So overfished is the Mediterranean at this point that pretty much, again, we've replaced a wild population with a farm population. So the story of the sea bass is really the story of an ongoing effort at everything it took from a biotech standpoint to figure out the sea bass. It's kind of like a Mediterranean-level Manhattan Project. I mean, the Israelis were involved, the Italians, the French, all sorts of people involved, in the Greeks particularly. And it turns out Greece was the key to really unlocking it as a commercial fish because Greece actually, if you look at a map of Greece, the coast is very crenellated. And what that means is that you have, that accounts for a condition called very low fetch, which means the distance the wind has to travel over open water. And of course, high winds are very bad for aquaculture because it's going to cause big storms and lots of turbulence and the breaking of nets and escaping of fish. Greece doesn't have that. Greece has lots of little, tiny, nice little, romantic coves where you go on your Greek vacation. And I should also add that it was the Greek vacation, it was the Greek package holiday that probably, more than anything else, led to the domestication of this fish. Because what you had was all these people suddenly, all British Airways, suddenly all these package tours, people going to Greece, they saw the traditional Greek meal of having the grilled whole fish on a plate. Who here has been to Greece? You've seen that the big fish on the plate, right? So, that's really what people wanted, but that worked fine as long as you had a traditional domestic demand. But once it became an international demand, there just was not enough sea bass, and that is one of the main things that led to that domestication. And going back to the salmon and looking at both the sea bass and salmon, is that both of these fish are high-level predators. Both of these fish are not traditional common fare. And it's very interesting, it's very important when you hear the blah blah of the aquaculture industry talking about what we're doing is we're creating more food for people. No. What we're doing is we're taking luxury products and we're turning them into commonplace products. These fish should never probably have been as commonly eaten as they are today. It was a major, major mistake in my opinion. Why? Because all of these fish up there, up on the wall here, require a tremendous amount of feed. Salmon, in the early days of salmon farming, took as much as 3 to 6 pounds of wild fish to grow a single pound of salmon. They've gotten that down with better feeding practices, but it's still significant. Sea bass around 3 pounds, codfish 2 to 6, something like that. Bluefin tuna, which they're now bringing into domestication now, as much as 15 to 20 pounds of wild fish to make a single pound of bluefin tuna. So these are, these are not the right things. Which sort of segues into the real fish that feeds people. That baby, the cod. Anyone ever catch a cod? I love catching cod. That's the thing. I always have to remind people that, I'm not against fishing. I'm not even against aquaculture. What I'm against is sort of the idiotic use of resources. And if you want to look at an example of idiotic use of resources, well, your cod is a very good example. Those of you who've read Mark Kurlansky's book, Cod, know very well that this is a fish that was a fish of the masses. This is a fish that, basically, we've been in the age of cod for close to 1,000 years now. I think Kurlansky calls it, we're at the end of a 1,000-year fishing spree. These fish were discovered in large aggregations on continental shelves by Vikings, by the Basques, heavily fished, but always actually fished mostly with hook and line through most of history, gradually moving to trawl catching. But up until World War II, the catch of cod probably was not debilitating. What cod really represent is the industrialization of fishing, and that's to me, to my mind, the real problem with fishing. There are all sorts of nice coastal fishing industries out there that have always understood the limitations of their immediate ecologies. What cod did is it turned fishing into a huge international business. The development of the largest industrial trawlers ever built. And it also what's interesting is that cod and the buildup of industrial fishing really are fed and informed and powered directly by World War II. After World War II, agriculture was in ruins. People needed to eat something. But at the same time, there was a huge boost in all of the technologies that led to the industrialization of fishing. Sonar, advanced polymers that could be used. Well, sonar for finding fish, advanced polymers that could be used for making lightweight long lines and nets. All these kinds of things grow out of World War II. And in the Western world, it's mostly directed at cod, but as I'll talk about in a little bit, it eventually gets ramped up to hit tuna as well. So in the cod chapter, I look at the collapse of cod, but I really kind of take off where Mark Kurlansky left off. As I said earlier, I did bring Mark in to see if he could taste the difference between a farmed and wild cod. And I visited the Shetland Islands, a place to see a place that's trying to farm cod and go into why I don't think that's such a good idea. And it's, it was an interesting adventure, and I reported it. It's funny, when I reported on it for the New York Times, I was less informed about aquaculture, and I sort of reported it as a success story. But by the time the company that I profiled went bankrupt, I could see that it was not a success story. So, we journalists, we make these mistakes. And then we write books to make it seem as if we never made those mistakes. Anyway, but so cod also, though, the cod chapter also leads me into a longer discussion of other fish that do work for aquaculture. And that's where I go into talking about fish like the trawl from Vietnam. How many people have seen a fish called swai in the marketplace lately? Anybody see swai? Yeah. So swai, as somebody put it to me, is the American catfish farmer's gift to the Vietnamese catfish industry. There's a whole sort of trade war between the American catfish growers and the Vietnamese catfish growers, because we in America, we grow channel and blue catfish, or a hybrid of both. They're pretty good, they're great aquaculture fish from a feed standpoint. They don't need any fish meal. They actually create a net gain of wetlands, because what happened is catfish farming in this country started because when the Soviet grain embargoes hit, suddenly farmers didn't have enough money from their grain, so they started flooding their corn and their soy fields and turning them into catfish ponds. So they actually created wetlands in the process and brought in a lot more birds, these places that probably wouldn't be there if those ponds weren't there. But anyway, the real deal that's been happening lately, though, is that the catfish farmers, they had this whole industry going, which was really working well. But then, lo and behold, the Vietnamese discovered this fish called the tra. It's also called pangasius. Sometimes it's called mistakenly called basa, which is another similar species from Vietnam. And they sold it in America as catfish, and of course that provoked this huge trade war. And now they're only allowed to call it swai. So it's, you can see who won that battle. Anyway, but the thing about tra and the thing about tilapia, which is another sort of white flaky fish, which is the sort of fish niche that cod fill, the sort of industrial niche that's used for fish sticks, the way of fish sandwiches, all those kinds of things. Those kinds of needs, in my opinion, can be met through aquaculture. And the reason is because something like a tilapia, something like a catfish, something like a tra, these are largely vegetarian fish. They can be grown in facilities that don't have direct contact with the wild. There, of course, are problems of invasiveness. Tilapia are very invasive, and so in areas where they're grown in open lakes and support the escape, it can take over lakes and do all sorts of bad things. But just seen from an energistic point of view, to my mind, it makes more sense to farm tilapia than it does to industrial fish cod, to scrape the bottom clean again and again and again, which, as we've seen, just won't hold up over time. And now the big battle that's kind of going on with fish is really not, cod is really basically out of the race now at this point, at least Atlantic cod, at least in the United States. So the real knockdown drag-out fight is going on between tilapia and Alaska pollock. Anybody here ever knowingly eat an Alaska pollock? All right, so at least one person. Alaska pollock is one of the most consumed fish in this country. It's in everything. Alaska pollock, if you ever had a California roll, that fake crab with a K, that's pollock. It's in the filet fish sandwich. It's in a lot of fish sticks. And we take about 3 billion pounds of Alaska pollock from the sea every year. Of course, the biomass of cod is said to be around 60 billion pounds. And the pollock industry assures us that they're doing this in a sustainable way. They're certified by the Marine Stewardship Council, which is one of the sustainable seafood labeling schemes out there. But, as a guy named Ted Ames, who's a cod fisherman, is trying to bring cod fishing back to Maine and saw the cod collapse with his own eyes, I was asking him, he's trying to rebuild the codfish industry in Maine around small artisanal fleets that, really bring in a higher quality product that's not going to be used for industrial purposes. I asked him, what do you think of this pollock thing? Do you think pollock is really doing it right? And he said to me, this is a huge industry. And a friend of mine said to me once, a very useful thing, he said, never get between a fat hog and a trough. It'll run you over every time. And people who are sort of against the pollock industry say that, in fact, that's what we've got, is that we've got a big fat hog that has a monopoly on this codfish fishery, that they're able to, dictate certain terms of, the quota they can take. They claim, they always talk about how pollock is a mid-trawl fishery, but National Marine Fisheries found that they're trawl for in contact with the bottom 40% of the time. which, bottom trawling is probably one of the worst things that you can do to an ocean environment. So, I try in this book not to make any like summary judgments on anyone. I just try and put out what the different sides are saying. But I certainly was somewhat won over by the thought that certain fish might work better as farm fish in that particular bowl. Anyway, finally, the last fish on the list is tuna. And if there are any tuna taxonomists in the audience, they could probably, I think that's a yellowfin tuna, but I actually never got the final approval on it. Apparently the yellowfin, anyone a taxonomist out there?
No, but I caught one.
Ah, yeah, me too. What do you think, yellowfin or bluefin?
Bluefin.
Bluefin, really?
Yellowfins have longer dorsals.
Yeah.
Really? I don't know. See, I was told it was by the pectoral. And, but, you know what? We'll go back to the photographer at some point to figure that out. That's one of those things where it's like, you're trying to finish the book and what does this cover work? And it's like, yeah, well. But I was just happy that originally in the place of the tuna, they had a striped bass. Great. Anyway, so tuna was really the chapter where I really decided to start thinking about fish beyond this sort of food question and really start looking at them as wildlife. And a lot of people don't necessarily get it that fish are wildlife. And even in our very terminology and the words we use around fish are serve to debase them. The word seafood, for example, you wouldn't call everything that we got from land, you wouldn't call it land food, right? And what's interesting is that this word translates across cultures. Romance languages call it fruit of the sea. Slavic languages, dari moria, gifts of the sea. This sort of free thing that you pick it or gets given to you. Not that it's wild animals. Vegetarians. Anyone know, I won't cause you to ask yourself, but anyone know a vegetarian out there who eats fish? Yeah, so like, what's that about? I mean, why? It's sort of like saying, all right, so I'm not going to eat farmed animals. I'm just going to eat vegetables and wild animals. So, I mean, you can make your judgments. I personally think that you shouldn't call it vegetarian if you eat fish. So anyway, so what I do in the tuna chapter is to kind of look back in time and look a little bit at those animals that have made the transition into wildlife. And I look in particular at whales. And what's interesting to note is that a couple hundred years ago, even though Linnaeus had established, and scientists before Linnaeus had long established that whales, were mammals, that they weren't fish. There was a very famous trial that took place in the 1820s in New York, where a candle maker was sued by an inspector because he had bought 3 barrels of fish oil that weren't inspected. They just passed a new law that you couldn't buy fish oil unless it was inspected. The candle maker said, well, you know what? That's not fish oil. That's whale oil, and whales are not fish. So this went to trial. And it was the underwater monkey trial of its day. There's a great book called Trying Leviathan, which was sort of my primary source on this. And an enlightenment naturalist who was also a state senator from New York, Mitchell was his name, gave endless testimony about how whales breathe air, they were warm-blooded, they nursed their young, showed slides, that showed examples of autopsies, made whalers come in, all this kind of thing. Jury deliberated for not very long, came back and gave the verdict. Whales are fish. It's sort of familiar, right? It resonates with the kind of stuff that goes on in modern politics. But fortunately, what's interesting is around that same time was when a whale ran the whale ship Essex. Not very long after the trial rolled. And of course, as some of you know who've read the Daniel Philbrick know, the Essex was the model for Moby Dick. And from that point forward, there started to become this notion of agency. And in the book, I go into the different people who started making the case for whale intelligence. But when it comes to comparisons between whales and tuna, of course tuna don't have the classic, intelligence that we know that whales have at this point. They don't have the linguistic thing going on. It's a very, very different animal. Nevertheless, one thing a lot of people don't know, bluefin tuna, as well as yellowfin and a couple of the other big tunas, are warm-blooded. I mean, it's not classic warm-blooded in a mammalian sense, but they can raise their body temperature 20 degrees above ambient. They can swim up to 40 miles an hour. They regularly cross the ocean, both in the Atlantic and the Pacific. They can dive to 1,500 feet. Were this animal on land, this would be a cheetah, or some kind of super cheetah, because I don't know a cheetah that can run to the top of Kilimanjaro and run back, and then go chase a squid. So, I mean, it's an incredible animal. So, and the other thing where the parallel with tuna happens is just in terms of the range. You know, whales and tuna both span the oceans. Both of them, de facto, are stateless fish. Very, very, very hard to regulate. Now, bluefin tuna is a very extreme example where the populations of bluefin are down between 95 and 80%, depending on the stock and the opinion of the scientists. The overall situation with tuna, it depends who you talk to again, but you know, Dan Pauly, who's the guy who sort of makes these more dire predictions, he and others have echoed the idea that 90% of big fish gone at this point. Other scientists I've talked to say 25% of tuna across the board are gone. Either way you look at it, it's both cause for extreme alarm, but also extreme hope in the sense that none of these fish we're dealing with are extinct or going extinct right this second. Everything that we eat, everything on the board right now has a chance, and a pretty good chance. So, you know, that's sort of where we stand with things. Anyway, I'm going to take your questions in a sec, but I thought I'd just sort of, you know, read a little bit, just a couple of pages from the book. As I said, I grew up fishing not too far from here. Well, I grew up in Connecticut and fished around on Long Island Sound a lot. But as an adult, I sort of stopped fishing for a while, but then I came back to fishing in my 30s. And thought I'd read you a little bit about just one particular fishing trip. That was probably the last tuna trip I went out where I actually had the intention of killing something. And this was actually just a couple of weeks after September 11th. I was fishing next to a guy named Steve, and he had just walked out of Tower 2, and his wife told him that he could go fishing whenever he wanted to as a result. So that was very sweet. Anyway, so we're fishing next to me. He's fishing next to me, and I'd just gotten a bite from a big tuna. And we're on a boat called the Explorer out of Brooklyn. People don't know this, but you can go just 100 miles off of Brooklyn and catch tuna as big as me in the fall. So the boat was called the Explorer. Like the Explorer, tuna are all engine. On the line, they feel like no other fish, and one can almost imagine the Schwarzenegger-like muscles flexing and pulsing their myoglobin-rich tissue in coordinated, punishing synchronization. They are the one fish out there that makes a fisherman think, I don't know if I can do this. As the tuna sprinted off, I sank into a kind of squat, trying to shift the stress from my back onto my knees. This in turn caused a problem. I had worn extra wide pants to accommodate long underwear, but the weather was downright balmy out on the Hudson Canyon, and I had shed my long underwear before coming to the rails. Now as the tuna surged forward, I bent my knees in a defensive crouch. My baggy pants fell down to my knees. When I reached around to pull them back up, the tuna seemed to sense it and swam even harder. My pants finally settled midway down my thighs. Steve came up behind me. You don't look so good, he said. I know. You wanted me to take that pole from you? No, I'm fine, I said. You don't have to be ashamed, he said. Tuna are tough. I know. 10 minutes into the fight, the tuna stopped swimming, and I stopped reeling. Steve stood by my side and shook his head. Jesus, he said. Then all at once, it turned and charged the boat. Reel back, reel, 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 Steve shouted. I put my head down and cranked, trying to take up the slack. Jesus, buddy, watch out, I heard Steve cry. I opened my eyes and saw that the hood strings of my sweatshirt were dangling in my reel. I was about to be bound, Ahab-like, to my fishing pole. Gingerly, Steve reached around my shoulders and tucked the sweatshirt strings into my collar. Thanks, man, I said. Doing good, buddy. The tuna began swimming a broad, slow arc around the boat. It's the death spiral, Steve said solemnly. The death spiral diameter decreased with each big circle. 3 more circles and I dared to peek over the rails. Way down, just below the glow of the boat's running lights, I saw a muted green flash. Hey, Steve called out, we got a color here. A mate came by and looked down into the water. Well, that's greening over that little thing, he said. The mate lowered the gap. I held my breath. Sometimes when tuna see the shiny metal hook coming at them, they streak off in a ridiculous last-ditch escape run, sometimes tail walking across the water before busting the line. But the mate dipped down agilely and struck into the fish's flesh. He tried to lift it into the boat. Jesus, he said. Not so little, I asked? Not so little. The mate was yanked onto his tiptoes by the unseen force below. Steve thought fast and grabbed another gap and struck. He and the mate swayed back and forth like a pair of girls doing the hula. Then they each exhaled, counted to 3, and raised their gaffs hand over fist in sync. The fish rolled over the rail, furious. Steve shook his gaff free and jumped back. The tuna hit the deck hard. It was a yellowfin tuna, and true to its name, its dozen-odd finlets running down the aft ridges of its torso glowed canary bright in the darkness. In spite of its hard fight, the fish was still angry and dangerous and as big as an adolescent. Its huge, superheated eye met mine, and we both gasped for air. If the tuna had had a voice and the power of reason, it would have screamed and pleaded at this point. But the only expressive thing about a tuna is its tail. All a tuna ever does its whole life is crank its tail back and forth with great determination. Even after it's caught, even after it's in the air, it never occurs to the tuna to switch off its relentless tuna engine. Bap, 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 it goes until the mate cuts its throat and the blood pours out onto the deck. Bap, 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 bap. The engine runs cold and then stops. Congrats, said Steve. Thanks, I said, and vomited. So, that's the book in a lecture shelf. I'm happy to take any of your questions, and anything you want. Sir?
2 questions. Really great presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I really enjoyed the book.
Good.
But 2 questions.
Yeah.
One, to what degree is the collapse of these fisheries a result of overfishing versus ocean acidification and other problems? And the other question I have is these fish like the salmon cod that are being farmed now, why are we seeing these collapses? And maybe it's a related question. Why are we seeing collapses when there's no more or limited amount of commercial fishing going on?
Yeah.
Why aren't they bouncing back?
Yeah, excellent question. The first thing, what is overfishing and what are other environmental factors? Well, ocean acidification, in my mind, is still too early to quantify, but I'm sure it's a factor. One of the things, though, that is an environmental factor that I think you can start to quantify is the loss of forage fish, and that being the small fish that a lot of these bigger fish eat. Herring, for example, used to run into rivers in the mouths of Maine, in Maine rivers, and codfish used to follow herring right into the mouths of rivers. Today, this is in the book, because these sort of historical reconstructions of codfish populations found that there were codfish in the mouths of rivers regularly. So we lost a lot of these forage fish because of small-scale dams, because of the reduction industry. So the equivalent of the human weight of the United States is taken from the sea in the form of forage fish every year. 20-30% of that goes to feeding pigs and chickens. Do we need to feed pigs and chickens fish? I don't think so. Ocean acidification is clearly going to have an effect on plankton, on calciferous organisms that are at the bottom of the food chain. Corals are going to suffer. I don't really know the numbers on that one yet. There is a movie called A Sea Change, which is probably worth seeing, that talks a lot more in detail about that. The other question about farming is this causing some degree of what's happening with? Well, so there are farming methods that actually do hurt fish. A lot of salmon farming is done in the pathways of wild salmon migration. So you're seeing diseases like infectious salmon anemia, parasites like sea lice jump from the farm into wild populations. Hard to document, but it does seem to be having some effect, which is why I generally say that aquaculture needs to be kept separate from the wild. I don't think that there's any evidence yet. I've never seen a fishery that can clearly show that farming fish is reducing pressure on wild fish. You could maybe make that argument with striped bass, because 60% of striped bass today are farmed. It's a hybrid fish that they farm, not a pure striped bass, and they farm it in ponds and in freshwater waterways that are out of contact with the wild fish. So there could be some net benefit there. But I feel like the governments of the world and overall, we need to start looking a little more holistically about aquaculture and fisheries and say, okay, we can only get this much from fisheries, we can get this much from aquaculture, but let's not use aquaculture to then further increase fish consumption, which seems to have been the case whenever we add an aquaculture species or industry. That seems to have been the case. Sorry, yeah.
Do you believe the statistics that you're getting from the regulatory agents about fish in general, and commercial fishing?
Which ones?
ICAT.
Oh, I tend to think that fisheries are a data-poor environment in general. And also, you have to keep in mind, whenever you talk about numbers of fish left or estimates of fish gone, nobody's actually going out there and counting individual fish. These are based on mathematical models based on sampling. So you sample a given tract of water, and then you build out your model from there. What is interesting to note is that as recently as 50, 60 years ago, people thought that we could take 400 million tons of fish or fish and shellfish from the seas every year. Since that prediction was made, the world catch has plateaued between 80 to 90 million tons. That's still the equivalent of the human weight of China pulled out of the sea every year. But it's a fifth of what they said could come from the sea. And there are a lot of people who think that should be, again, half of what it is now, that maybe 40 million tons might be a more realistic goal. As far as ICAT and the different organizations that oversee tuna, I think it's very data poor, and I think they need to be much more conservative in their catch estimates. Yes, ma'am?
What was the result of tasting the cod?
I can't tell you that. I have to read the book. I can tell you I've tasted the farm cod quite a bit, and to my mind, what farm cod tastes like is striped bass. And it's partially because I feel like farm cod, they're fed a much different diet. Wild cod are much more omnivorous. Most fish off the farm are more omnivorous, and it's one of the reasons that farm fish can sometimes have higher toxicity because they're eating higher on the food chain as farm fish than they would as wild fish. Like a sockeye salmon, for example, eats zooplankton and little crustaceans. That's what its diet is. A farmed Atlantic salmon, meanwhile, is eating herring and capelin and all these other fish that are ground up and feed. Sir.
What is the process of coming up with food for the farm?
Well, up until recently, it's mostly just fishing. I mean, the way the aquaculture industry started, it was two brothers, the Bluefin brothers in Norway, and they just threw herring into the net pens for the salmon. Since then, feed science has actually gotten very, very complex. And they are, one of the reasons the feed conversion ratio, or what they call the FIFO, the fish in, fish out ratio for salmon, has gone down, depending on who you talk to, from 3 to 6 to 1 to 1.5 to 1 is what they're saying in the industry right now. Still, there's some funky math going on there. But a lot of it's because they're using much more soy. They're also selectively breeding the fish to match a diet that is lower in fish meal. The holy grail of it all would be to synthesize a fish meal a fish feed that has no fish meal requirements. And they are close to doing that. I was talking to a guy named Frederick Barrows at USDA, who's a fish meal scientist, and he always likes to say, fish require nutrients, not ingredients. That in other words, you could get to this nutritional profile through algae, through soy, through different means other than fish. Is that a good thing to do? I'm not so orthodox about it. I don't mind grinding up feather meal, which is often used as a fish meal substitute, and feeding that to fish. Fish will eat anything. They tend to be pretty aggressive on all fronts, and so I don't mind it as long as toxins aren't being passed along. And I agree with the idea of trying to utilize any waste product. I mean, there's huge amounts of fish that are wasted just on the fillet table after you fillet the fish. Carcass gets thrown back in the water. That's a lot of potential meal that could work to feed the industry. So,
I was wondering what you had to say about swordfish, because I know that it was on the do not eat list, and then it got back onto the you can eat list. So
right.
I was wondering what happened.
Well, first of all, when you say any fish, you can't say swordfish is not all fish. It's like the example I use in the book is that just because they're starving in Darfur doesn't mean that humanity is starving. It's a different nation. And the main swordfish concern that caused all of the red listing was the Atlantic swordfish. And actually, it's a very interesting story. It's in the book, but it's an interesting parallel because it informs the so-called sustainable seafood movement to this day. What happened with swordfish is that the main thing affecting swordfish was long lining for swordfish in the Gulf of Mexico during spawning season. Really stupid thing to do. Well, you know, it's like going out, if you're a hunter, it's like going out, let's shoot all the does. You know, that's the equivalent. And it's happening, and it was very easily fixable. And so a great woman named Vicky Sproul, founder of the organization called SeaWeb, she started this campaign called Give Swordfish a Break. And the idea was to get chefs to take swordfish off the menu. And since then, we've seen take a pass on Chilean sea bass, you know, caviar, mTOR. This is silly. But the swordfish thing actually worked in the sense that it got National Marine Fisheries Service to actually close the spawning grounds to fishing during spawning season. So that's what happened. That's what changed. But the message that got to consumers was, oh, if I eat less swordfish, swordfish will be safe. It doesn't really work that way. You eat less swordfish, you scare the industry, and then the industry changes. So what sprang out of that whole Give the Swordfish a Break campaign were these lists from Monterey Bay and so forth that say this is red, this is green, whatever. But this is an area where I think things have gotten too diffuse. Because there's not a campaign around every one of those fish on the red list. You know, it's more like we need to focus and get, you know, to Monterey Bay credit, what they were really trying to do is educate consumers. Before those cards existed, a lot of people didn't know the damages of bottom trawl. They didn't know what was going on with swordfish in their spawning grounds. So, but as we're getting there, we're getting to that sort of 10% of the population that knows some of this stuff. That's where I really think we need to advocate for 3 or 4 very concrete goals in the ocean. More marine protected areas, rebuilding of forage fish populations, elimination of certain fishing techniques altogether. Those are the things we need to be looking for, not necessarily eating this fish or that fish. Okay, I'll take one more. Sir?
In the book, you talk about something you call integrated aquaculture.
Yes.
It sounds promising.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. It's IMTP, integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. That sounds like a Gilman Sullivan. But anyway, what they're doing there in the Bay of Fundy is basically, you know, salmon, when you farm salmon, they produce a lot of waste. And a lot of waste just sinks to the bottom, causes nitrogen load in the water, algal blooms, and all these kinds of things. There's a very interesting guy named Thierry Chopin, who's an algae scientist, and he did the funny aside to me the other day. If you think fish don't get attention, take a look at algae. But anyway, he's very involved in growing commercial algae. You know, cosmetic industry uses algae quite a bit, and they're also edible food. Kelps are often used for edible food. So he figured out that if you grew algae along with mussels, and then finally sea cucumbers, that you could filter out, you know, the large particulates, the small particulates, and the microscopic level nitrogen waste into the water. And in fact, instead of getting a monoculture, which as we all know, I think a lot of people here know the dangers of monoculture. We all know the message of corn and CAFOs and all those kinds of things. Instead of getting a monoculture of salmon, you get a quadroculture, you know, of seaweed, mussels, sea cucumbers, and salmon, which, you know, strikes me as a great idea. Now, does it solve all problems? Does it solve problems like sea lice? They haven't come up with an edible fish that's going to eat the sea lice, and then we need that. But it's certainly set in the right direction. So.
Paul,
Yeah.
many thanks. Great talk. We'll look forward.
If anyone would like to ask a follow-up question, if you go to forfish.org, there's a Facebook link, and I do eventually get to those questions. It takes me a little time, but feel free to post a question.
So Paul will be available up front here, courtesy of Merritt Bookstore, who we partner with on these book lectures and book signings. For those of you that would like to purchase a copy of Four Fish. As the president of the Institute, I want to again thank you for coming tonight. Remind you that these public programs are part of the things that our membership here supports, and I'd urge all of you to consider, if you haven't already, joining the Carey Institute's Aldo Leopold Society so we can continue to bring these kinds of fine programs to you during the course of the year. Keep your eye tuned on our website for upcoming programs. And once again, Paul, great talk. I may become, I don't know about a vegetarian, but I might like my fish load here.
Smaller fish fish and more shellfish. That's the answer.
Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.